Mr. President, less than 2 months ago, President Biden emphasized a theme of unity at his inauguration. I quote, "Today, on this January day, my whole soul is in this," he said, "bringing America together, uniting our people, uniting our nation," end quote. Admirable words, Mr. President, but so far they haven't been met with much action. On the first big legislative test of his presidency, coronavirus legislation, President Biden and Democrats in Congress have pursued a resolutely partisan course. They've not only failed to invite Republican input in any meaningful way, they've deliberately excluded it by passing their coronavirus package using budget reconciliation. This allows them to pass the bill in the Senate by a simple majority vote instead of requiring the concurrence of 60 senators to move to a vote on the bill, which is typically how legislation is passed here in the Senate, including the 5 coronavirus bills that we passed last year when the Republicans had the majority here in the Senate. Now, Mr. President, Democrats' decision to use reconciliation might be understandable if Republicans had declared our opposition to any further coronavirus legislation. But of course, that's not the case. Republicans made it clear that we were willing to work with Democrats on additional coronavirus legislation. In fact, 10 Republican senators put together a plan and met with President Biden for 2 hours to discuss a bipartisan agreement. But while the President listened to them graciously, Democrats and the President quickly made it clear that they intended to move forward without Republican input. 2 days after Republicans met with President Biden, the House passed its partisan budget resolution to pave the way for reconciliation here in the Senate. 2 days later, the Senate followed suit. Clearly, there were no plans to let negotiations with Republicans slow down the partisan juggernaut. In fact, Democrats have been pretty determined to make sure Republicans don't have a voice in this legislation at all. During markups of the COVID relief package in House committees, Republicans offered a number of amendments, 245 amendments to be exact. Out of those 245 amendments, Democrats accepted exactly 1 for the final bill. 1, Mr. President. Among the amendments House Democrats rejected were common sense proposals to the school funding, to the reopening, to tie, I should say, school funding to the reopening of schools. There was an amendment to unfreeze funding for the coronavirus food assistance program for farmers and ranchers. There were amendments to target funding to overlooked rural communities, and an amendment to protect health care providers from frivolous lawsuits. Mr. President, the one thing that can be said for the House is that at least it gave members in the House a chance to review the bill in committee. Here in the Senate, Democrats' COVID package will come to the floor without any committee consideration. Senators are just supposed to accept whatever the House sent over or whatever changes the Senate Democrat leader makes, minus those items that are excluded from a reconciliation package by Senate budget rules. Mr. President, Democrats' partisan course on COVID legislation is particularly disappointing because up until now, COVID relief has been a bipartisan process. That's right. To date, Congress has passed 5 COVID relief bills, and every single one of those bills was overwhelmingly bipartisan. The Republican-led Senate took up and passed COVID relief legislation by margins of 96-1, 90-8, 96-0, 92-6, and 1 even went by voice vote here in the Senate. Back then, of course, Democrats thought that the minority party should have a voice in the process. In fact, the Democrat leader filibustered the original CARES Act, our largest COVID bill to date, multiple times until he got a version that he was satisfied with. Now that the Democrats are the majority, however, they've decided that minority representation can be dispensed with. It's Democrats' way or the highway on COVID legislation. Republicans and the Americans that they represent will not be allowed to contribute. I guess it's not surprising, Mr. President. After all, if Democrats had pursued a bipartisan process, they would probably have had to eliminate some of the non-COVID related provisions in this legislation, like the $86 billion bailout of multi-employer pension plans. Hardly a coronavirus emergency. They might have been forced to trim their slush fund for states and ensure that the distribution formula wasn't weighted heavily in favor of blue states. Senator from Illinois was just down here talking about the importance of helping out the states. Well, under the formula that they've designed for this relief package, the dollars skew heavily, surprisingly, to states like New York, where the Democrat leader is from, or California, where the House Speaker is from, or Illinois, where the Senate Democrat whip is from. It seems like a lot of states around the country, Mr. President, sort of got left out when it came to how to distribute what is going to be a huge amount of money that's going to go out to state and local governments if the Democrats have their way with this bill. They might have had to reject a measure to give labor unions and Planned Parenthood access to loans designed to help small businesses. Again, hardly something that we ought to be doing in a coronavirus relief bill that is designed to make sure that small businesses stay viable, but it does satisfy a lot of Democrat special interest groups. They might have had to tie funding for schools to school reopening. Seems like a fair consideration. There was an amendment offered during the budget resolution when it was being considered on the floor of the Senate, Mr. President, that would have required schools where every teacher had had the vaccination to reopen in order to qualify for federal assistance under this legislation. But there's nothing in that in this bill. There's nothing that, of all the money, the $128 billion which will go out to schools, which, by the way, we put $68 billion out there already, much of which hasn't been spent. But all this money that would go out to the schools, there is no stipulation anywhere in this legislation that would attempt to tie funding for schools to their reopening so that we can get our kids back to school and learning again in that environment. In fact, Mr. President, it would be arguable, I think, that the schools, if the teachers can get vaccinated, and that was the very language of the amendment that was offered in the budget resolution by Republicans. It was defeated here in the Senate, 50-50 vote. All Republicans voted for it, all Democrats against it. But again, all it simply said was that if you are going to get federal funding under this bill and all of the teachers in your school are vaccinated against the coronavirus, then you have to reopen. If you don't reopen, after all the teachers have been vaccinated, then you don't get funding under this bill. That seems like a fairly straightforward request, given the fact that so many schools across this country and so many of our kids continue to have to learn virtually at a time when we need to have them in the classroom, Mr. President. And this is obviously something that wasn't included in this legislation. I would argue, Mr. President, that all the changes that I just mentioned would have made the bill better, but they might not have made the Democrat allies as happy. Mr. President, this whole process could have been different. We could be here today with another bipartisan COVID bill that would speed up vaccination and help our country through the rest of the pandemic. In fact, as I said, there were lots of Republicans who were interested in negotiating, sitting down with Democrats to do just that. The Democrat whip, senator from Illinois, was just down here saying, boy, wouldn't it be great if this could be bipartisan like the other bills that we've done earlier that were bipartisan. I would simply point out the obvious, Mr. President, and that is that all the bills that were done last year when Republicans had the majority here in the Senate were bipartisan because we did them under regular order. We did them under the 60-vote threshold that's required to move legislation through the Senate. What the Democrat leadership has opted to do is to use a rarely used legislative vehicle here, budget reconciliation, to do a bunch of things that they can do simply with 51 votes, and it was pretty clear to me that they had no intention ever of including Republican ideas or involving Republicans in developing this legislation or ultimately having Republican support for it in the end. In fact, that was probably made most clear by a statement made by the Chief of Staff to President Biden in the White House when he described this as the most progressive domestic legislation in a generation, suggesting, of course, that this is filled with all kinds of liberal priorities, most of which have very little to do with the coronavirus. In fact, if you look at where the funding goes in this, so the $1.9 trillion, less than 10%, Mr. President, deals with funding for public health care. In other words, funding for vaccines, either for production or distribution, funding for providers, funding for mental health, funding for anything related to health care, Mr. President. If you look at the $1.9 trillion, it's less than 10%. Less than 10% of that is actually directed at addressing the actual health care crisis that we're facing as a nation. And all I would simply say is that it's pretty clear to me that if Democrats had wanted to, they could have had, easily could have had, a bipartisan bill. There are 10 Republicans I know today who would have voted for a bill that would include funding for vaccines, that would include funding for the Paycheck Protection Program, that would include funding for unemployment checks, actually would have included funding for direct checks to go out, which I know is a very popular thing. But, Mr. President, that consultation never occurred, that desire to get input never happened, that offer to allow the committees of jurisdiction to even have a voice or any input into this. And frankly, if I'm a Democrat here in the Senate, I'd be outraged that my committees were bypassed completely. There was no consideration at any committee here in the Senate, Mr. President, about what the contents of this legislation should be or what the substance of it should look like in the end. It was literally ramrodded, come from the House of Representatives, taken up by the Democrat leadership, and no input from the committees, Republicans for sure, but also Democrats, of all people, who you would think would want to be heard from. I mean, they got these chairmanships of these committees for a reason. You know, they finally got the majority, and they got committee gavels and all that, and here we're talking about $1.9 trillion in spending, and the committee chairs, the committees themselves had no action when it comes to shaping or in any way producing this legislation. So to suggest, Mr. President, that as the Democrat whip, Senator Durbin, did earlier, that he really hopes that this will be bipartisan, it's hard to take that even seriously given how this has proceeded and how the Democrats opted to do this relative to how the other 5 coronavirus relief bills were passed last year under a Republican majority. We are looking instead, Mr. President, at a partisan bill that directs billions of taxpayer dollars to projects and policies that have nothing to do with overcoming COVID. And just as one, again, observation, I made this point on the floor yesterday, but one thing that we need to remember here is that we are talking about real money here, and we're talking about it all being borrowed money. This is all money that goes on the debt. Every dollar that we are going to provide of the $1.9 trillion that's proposed in this Democrat bill is a borrowed dollar. It's all a dollar that goes on the debt which has grown dramatically in this last year, in some cases because we had to move aggressively, as we did last year at this time in March, with a bill that would get immediate assistance out there to people who desperately needed it. We were fighting at that time a major emergency, a major crisis. Well, here we're a year later. We have a very different perspective on the world today than we did 12 months ago. But that $1.9 trillion, when added to the other coronavirus relief bills, ends up being about $6 trillion. $6 trillion. I mean, that amount of money is just absolutely hard to comprehend and hard to fathom. And we're talking about compounding the $4 trillion or so that's already out there with another $2 trillion with this bill. And as I pointed out yesterday, Mr. President, some point the chickens come home to roost. You cannot continue down this path without consequence on the economy. Now, the argument in support of this legislation made by Democrats is we need to do more. We've got to get this out there. We've got to stimulate the economy. My fear, in a lot of respects right now, is the economy could be overstimulated. The Congressional Budget Office said just recently that without any additional assistance, the economy is going to grow in 2021 at 3.7%. And we are flooding the zone with so much money that the money supply numbers have been exploding. In 2020, money supply was up, M2 as they measure it, was up 26%. Year over year, from 2000 to 2019, average about 6%. This year it's going to be up another 12%. There's a lot of money, Mr. President, out there in the economy. What does that mean long-term for our economy and for the individual workers in our economy? Well, first off, it means that as there are more and more dollars chasing fewer goods, you're going to get inflation. That's inevitable. And when you get inflation, typically what happens is interest rates follow, because those who are buying that debt, if it's being lost to inflation, want to make sure that they're getting a return on their investment. So interest rates start to go up. When interest rates go up, the amount of money that we borrow becomes even more expensive because we have to pay interest. We have to finance that debt. And so the amount of interest that we will be, the amount of federal tax dollars that we will be using to pay for interest on the debt will explode and will swamp literally the amount of tax revenue coming in to this country. We know that because the debt is so large already. And we know that because interest rates have been low for a long time, which has lulled everybody into a sense of complacency that this isn't going to have any impact, that there's no downside. We can just keep borrowing because interest rates are low. Well, you keep putting as much money out there as we are, and another $2 trillion out there into the economy, Mr. President, I would argue that you are not only going to unleash inflation, which has dramatic consequence for our fiscal situation as a country, but it also has dramatic consequence for the personal financial situation of the American family, because when inflation takes off, everything that people have to buy, from food to gasoline to clothing, all those things go up. Inflation pushes the price of things higher, which means it's more expensive to the average family in this country. And then the other effect, Mr. President, long-term is when inflation starts to go up, as I said, interest rates start to follow. And we're already starting to see some evidence of that. And when interest rates go up, not only does the federal government, the fiscal picture, get much, much worse because the amount of tax dollars that we have to spend to finance our debt grows dramatically, but the American consumer also is faced with higher interest rates. So mortgage payments go up. If somebody's trying to finance a home, interest rates on cars, automobiles will go up. Interest rates on student loans go up. That also has a direct impact on the pocketbooks of people in this country. Mr. President, I'm going to just conclude, but I think it's really important to point out, and I know that my state's not indicative of every state around the country, and there are states that have legitimate different financial situations. But in South Dakota right now, we have 3% unemployment. We have a growing economy. We have a state that has already benefited significantly from earlier coronavirus relief legislation, to the point where there are dollars that they're still trying to figure out how to use from the previous installations of federal spending that we have put out there. It just seems to me that we ought to, given the potential adverse consequence of higher interest rates and higher inflation and higher debt and spending, think about that what we're doing here should be very targeted. It should be very specific. And we know now, we have a lot more insight into where the needs are in the economy than we did at this point last year in March when we did the first CARES package. But we're at a time now where it's very clear what those needs are. And we could come up with a much more targeted bill. Those 10 Republicans that I mentioned have come up with a bill that's in the $600 to $700 billion range, which addresses the health care issues, it addresses the unemployment insurance issues, it addresses the PPP program. It deals with direct checks, as I mentioned. It's got funding for education. I think some funding in there for state and local governments, which frankly, as I said, I'm not for. I would rather see us take those dollars, if they are going to put them somewhere, put them towards something that's more targeted, at least a formula that makes more sense. But let me just say that in my view, it is just really important right now that we be circumspect. We're talking about borrowed money. This is the House's dollars, Mr. President. This isn't just magic money that appears out of nowhere. Every single dollar that we are using is borrowed, will be added to the debt, will be a liability for somebody to have to pay back for our kids and our grandkids. And if the potential economic impacts that I mentioned actually occur and interest rates start to tick up, it's going to be a lot more expensive money to finance into the future. And I think that's a very real consideration, something we ought to be thinking long and hard about, not just because of the fiscal situation that the country faces right now, but because of the financial situation that every American family, as they sit around the kitchen table and talk about these pocketbook issues, will be looking at. If we see higher inflation, if we see higher interest rates, it's going to affect their jobs, it's going to affect their cost of living, and it's going to make it that harder for them to make ends meet. Less than 2 months after the President committed himself to unity at his inauguration, the first major bill of his presidency will be a resolutely partisan piece of legislation. Mr. President, I hope that this is not a sign of things to come. Mr. President, I yield the floor.